CD Stromberg is really notorious for wearing out throttle shafts, so just to go and buy a kit and put through it usually isn't a satisfactory rebuild. You'll also find that you may have to put shafts and discs through it as well. Now when you have a look at this one that I've taken out of this carburetor, you can see the disc is quite badly worn on the edge there. Throttle shafts are very heavily worn, and that's common for most CD Strombergs, and especially for triples. When you're running triples, any wear in the shafts here and in the disc here makes it very difficult to synchronize the carburetor. So you have to check that first, and the easiest way to do that is just to grab the discs and see if you can move them. Now these have got second-hand shafts in them. I didn't have new ones to put into it, and the customer didn't want new ones. He gave me half a dozen second-hand Stromies to steal the shafts out of, so I've managed to get that quite reasonable. And the second check you need to do is to actually pick this up and put it up against the light and see if you can see light through the bore. Now obviously you have to back off the idle screw so that the linkage isn't touching the screw, so the disc can completely shut. Hold it up to some light from the other side and see if you can see light through the edges or anywhere around the disc. If you can, then you need to probably look at replacing the disc at the very minimum, and if your shafts are really wobbly, then you'll have to put shafts in it as well. Now when you're assembling the shafts, make sure that the disc is fitted correctly. The disc is actually tapered on one side to match the angle that it's up against the bore, so don't put the disc in backwards, otherwise it won't seal properly. And when you're putting the disc in, close the throttle several times to centralize that disc before you tighten those screws up. Once it's all done and it's all tight, you should be able to hold that up to the light with the idle screw back right off, and you should see no light through there at all. It should be perfectly sealed. Alright, so this one's closing good now. It's not jamming, even though I've got the screw backed right off. It's not totally jamming in there, so it's nice and free. So we're ready now to put the rest of the kit through it. Okay, after taking care of the throttle shaft and disc, the very next thing I like to assemble in this carburetor is the metering jet assembly. Okay, quite easy. This is the original setup right here with the original washer that was there, and that's its order of assembly. Now you'll get a new washer in the kit. It may be the same thickness as the original washer. That one's quite thick, that one's quite thin. So if you're going to plan on using that thin washer, when you assemble all this into the carburetor body, and you'll see it coming out, protruding out of the base here, you just have to make sure it doesn't protrude past the surface there. If it does, then you can't use that thin washer. Alright, now what's important here is to realise what's happening when you're centralising your jet. After you assemble this and you've got it all together, you need to centralise the jet. And the jet is centralised by unlocking the main holder here, which holds all this jet assembly into place. So that ends up touching in there like so, and we have that in there of an O-ring, and then we have that washer in there. Now when we loosen this jet assembly is allowed to move around. Okay, and that's how we centralise the jet. Now if it's damaged on this surface here, or it's damaged in there, or that washer is rough, or it's damaged anywhere where that washer touches, when you back this off and you try and centralise it, this becomes stuck, and it becomes very hard to centralise. When you tighten this up, it grips onto that and actually moves it out of centralisation and jams it. So it becomes very difficult to centralise the jet when these parts aren't smooth and finished properly. So what you can do, if you've got a little bit of surface damage on there, you can put it on a little bit of very fine wet and dry and just give it a little bit of a touch up just to smooth it off. You can't obviously do that with this surface here because of the raised surface there. And you can make sure that that washer is perfectly smooth, so you could probably give that washer a little bit of a touch up as well, just to make it nice and smooth. Or alternatively fit the brand new washer, which will be undamaged. Okay, when you're assembling this, I've got the O-rings here that you can see placed out of the kit where they belong. Now the next important thing is you can actually put this into there dry like so, but you need to lubricate it before the jet assembly goes in, okay, because if we just push that in totally dry, we'll damage the O-ring. We also need to make sure that this jet assembly has got no damage on the surface where the O-ring is going to travel. Okay, any scores or burrs in there will just rip that O-ring. Alright, so make sure you've got that right. Now also when you're putting the O-rings on to here, Alright, you obviously have to push it over sharp edges, like if you're going to go from this side. If any sharp edges are on the nut side, you're going to cut grooves into that O-ring and the O-ring will fail. I like to put it in from this end, across the threads, and roll it across the threads, and then roll it into that groove. Okay, so if you roll it on nicely, you won't damage the O-ring. And I always like to use rubber grease when I'm assembling the seals. Same story with the jet adjuster. You can put it on from this end and roll it up, roll it over the threads. Once again, a little bit of rubber grease on that, and then it'll pop into there nicely. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that and get that ready for assembly into the body. Okay, when it comes time to putting the O-ring onto the jet adjuster, you may have to use a very fine little picker like this one and just get it underneath the O-ring, okay, without damaging the O-ring at all. Just get it underneath and then roll it over into the groove, and you'll be able to fit it that way. Okay, there we go. Okay, generous amount of rubber grease onto that ring, and we're ready to put it in. Okay, all I've done is just assemble the jet assembly in there, put that in that order that you saw it on the table, screw that in, and then we'll screw that in as well. The jet adjuster until it gets started on the thread, and then we just screw the whole assembly down until we can't get it down any further with our hands. Okay. When we look down inside, you can see that the jet assembly isn't sitting proud of the surface, so I've used the thin washer that came in the kit, and we'll leave that for now. As you can see there, it's nowhere near the centre, but we'll fix that up once we get the rest of the carburetor together. Alright, next thing now is the float level, and we can get the bowl on. Alright, obviously the needle seat has to go in before we can fit the float in, and now you'll get several washers in the kit, a thick one and they'll go down to thin. Now the easiest way to pick the washer is just use the same thickness washer that you actually pulled out in the first place. So if you've got a thick washer in there, when you pulled it apart, put the thick in to start off with. So you just fit that onto your needle and seat and screw the needle and seat in. Okay, and then nip it down reasonably tight. Now in this float here, I'm not going to actually use this float because it is quite badly worn where the needle and seat has been touching. That is just way too deep for my liking. So fortunately I've got a stack of spares of these, so I'll replace that one with one that's brand new. Virtually hasn't never been used. So we'll use that one instead. Okay, so all we do there is assemble it. Here we go, we've got the instruction sheet here, tells you exactly what the float level should be on the back page. Okay, just follow that instruction, you're done. Then you're ready to put the cover on. Oh, just a word here on the size of that needle and seat. It's not AF and it's not metric, so you're not going to get a socket that's going to fit on there or a spanner that will fit on there without damaging the corners of the needle. Alright, so what I've done is I'm using a deep impact socket, single hex, so I don't damage that as badly, and it is of 14mm. So when I put it on, it still has a little bit of movement, but it's not as bad as using a double hex. It's not as bad as using a double hex spanner, so I won't damage that as much. That is actually some sort of British standard spanner from the old days, obviously, because Zenith Strombergs have been around for quite a long time. But no one is going to have a British standard spanner except people in probably England. So this is the closest thing that you can use that won't damage it. When you're fitting the float, make sure that this bent part of the float is facing into the carburetor body and the flat surface is facing the bottom. You can fit this the other way around if you so wish, but you're not going to get the correct float level and it's going to interfere with the internal parts when the float's moving up and down. So make sure you've got that fitted the right way around, and then just clip it into its holders. Okay, it'll just clip in, and there we go. Now all we do is take that measurement directly from the measurement they give you on the instruction sheet, and we're done there. And then we can go ahead and put the gasket on and put our top on. Okay, when we go to put our top on, please ensure you've got rubber grease on that rubber seal so you don't tear it as it's going in through this bore. Very important, otherwise you'll have fuel leaks out of the bottom of your carburetor. And please ensure that all gasket material is removed from this surface as well as the carburetor body. And try and refrain from putting this on a piece of sandpaper and rubbing it to try and flatten it, because you'll notice that you've got a very small bead channel around the outside of this which digs into the gasket. If you remove that bead channel, there is a chance that your gasket may leak. I'm not saying that they will, but there is a chance it may. That little bead just helps the gasket seal a little bit better. So what you can do is, just to check that this is straight, is you could run it across a sheet of 1200 paper, just one stroke, and make sure that that paper has touched that bead all the way around, and that'll give you a good indication whether that's flat or not. Okay, but don't shave it off unless you absolutely have to. Just as a final word on the float, remember I said that you could put the same gasket thickness on that you took the needle and seat out originally, or you could use thinner ones to use as your adjustment. In the instruction sheet it says you can actually bend this tag to get your float level correct. Well, I don't like actually doing that. I like this tag to be at right angles to the needle pin, so it's at a tangent, because if you put, let's say we put a thin washer on and we have to now bend this down to meet the needle and seat to get the float level right, then it's no longer going to be at a tangent to the pin of the needle. So by putting a thicker washer on and leaving this dead flat across the surface here, we're actually getting the level set much more accurately. It's not, well, let me rephrase that, I'm not setting the level much more accurately, but what I'm doing is I'm getting the tangent or the pin touching at right angles to that lever, which gives me a much more efficient lever action to stop the needle and seat and stop fuel from coming in. Just a small point that I like to harp on. I'm a bit of man on geometry, so I like things to be set up correctly. Obviously, if you can't get the float level correct with the washers, then obviously you then have to bend the tag to get it right. So it'll only be a minor adjustment if you have to do it. So, but I like to keep that dead flat, that flange across there, that surface where the needle pin is going to touch, and just use the thickness of the washer to adjust my float level. Okay, with the float bowl now completely finished, what we need to do now is get this jet adjustment right up to the top until we get the jet sitting flush with the body of the carburetor along the top here. Okay, so that's what we need to get it to so we can centralize the jet properly. So what we do is we use a pair of vernier calipers to do that, and we just put that down inside there until it touches the jet itself, and then we get that down to a 0 level. Okay, now it's not level with the outer brass plug, it is level with the aluminium housing of the body of the carburetor. That's where we need to get the jet up to. Alright, so once you've done that, we're ready to reassemble the rest of it, put the top in, centralise the jet, and good to go. Alright, so this is an important step, especially when you're doing triples. Okay, it's not only important to use this as an aid to centralise the jet, but it'll become important when we go to do the actual adjustment on the triple carburetors. So, but we'll cover that later. Okay, now time to fit the diaphragm. Alright, you'll notice there's a little notch in the piston. That little notch is there for that little groove in your diaphragm. Okay, so your diaphragm should line up into that little groove, like so, and your diaphragm should pretty well fit in a natural state, just like it is there, without having to stretch it and pull it to get it into shape so that we can put this cap on. Okay, that little ring groove around the diaphragm sits inside this ring groove in this plate. Okay, so if that's not sitting in there correctly, just under its natural accord like it is now, then you really haven't got a very good kit. Okay, so if, let's say for instance, that's punched in like that and you actually have to physically pull that out to make it sit in there properly, that's not a very good diaphragm, it's been damaged, so you need to get another one. So all we do is just place the retaining cap on top, put the 4 screws in, the diaphragm is done. As a final check, just after you finish doing that, just check that there's no gaps between the diaphragm and the body of the piston all the way around. Bend your diaphragm down the other way and check it all the way around, make sure it looks like it's seating properly. Then restore the diaphragm back to its original position. Now we're ready to put the needle in. Fitting the needle is quite easy. Once you put the needle into the bore, all you have to do is get that flange level with the piston side. Just use a little screwdriver, push it down to there till it's level, and then tighten the screw. Okay, now all that's left is to put the piston in. So what I'll do is I'll back off my adjustment nut so that that jet retainer is loose in the bottom. We will put the needle into the jet, and then we have to make sure that the tang on the diaphragm lines up with the tang in the body of the carburetor. Okay, so that's quite tight to put in out because the jet wasn't centralised. Now it is, and there's the tang located, and you can see the diaphragm sits in absolutely beautifully. I don't have to force it into position. Alright, once that's in position, put your spring on, put your top housing on. Okay, if you wish you can lubricate the inside of that with a little bit of oil, just to make it slide a little better. When I put these together, we then put that tang there, or the tang here, facing outboard. Okay, now make sure the diaphragm hasn't shifted while you're rotating that, and just press it together, put your 4 screws in, and then we'll go about centralising the jet. Okay, just to make sure that the jet is sort of centralised, we need to raise the piston and drop it. And you can hear it quite clearly giving a distinct thud sound as the piston hits the bottom. That's exactly what we want after we tighten that bottom lock nut up. Yeah? Because remember, that's loose at the moment, so the jet can move around freely, so we can centralise it. Now, what is centralising the jet all about? Now, I'll show you with a needle and a jet as a separate item exactly what we're doing. Okay, we have the needle that's in the piston, we have the jet assembly that slides up and down in the bottom of the carburetor. By moving this jet assembly all the way up to the top till it touches that needle where we've got it flush with the piston, we've got the least amount of clearance between the needle and the jet. Now the jet hole is a 90th thou if it's a 90th thou jet, and the needle size at the top will be about 89 thou. So there's only about 1 thou clearance between the jet and the needle. So we need to have that right at the top when we're centralising the jet. Now all we're doing is by loosening the lock nut that's down at the bottom here that holds all this jet assembly into place, we allow this jet to move around and of course centralise, so that when we drop the piston, it drops into the jet and the jet moves around and centralises itself to the needle in the piston. Okay, and then we lock that assembly up down at the bottom so that this stays in place, so that the piston can move up freely from there on, and the jet will run smoothly down into the I should say the needle will run smoothly down into the jet. Alright. Okay, if you're going to do this in a vise, make sure you've got jaw protectors fitted to the vise jaws so you're not damaging the body of the carburetor. Okay, you'll need a 5/8" spanner to put onto the locking mechanism. Stick your thumb into the piston, keep lifting the piston. Now you'll notice I've got a screwdriver shaft fitted to the top just to add a little bit of weight to help it push the piston down against the jet. And you just keep lifting it up and down and keep tightening the lock nut, okay? And as long as you keep hearing that thud as you're tightening it, I've got that quite tight. Now I take the weight out and it should do it all on its own. That jet is now centralised. As easy as that. Now, alright, and of course you've got the oil at the top in the piston, so fill that up with light oil. Now you fill that up to around about the length of this piston from the top, and that will be enough room for you to get that piston in and push it in and screw it down. Now that gives it a dampening effect so the piston doesn't raise up very quickly, and you can fine tune how quick that comes up by the thickness of the oil. Okay, there you go. I've assembled one Stromberg carburetor for you. Now, if this is the only carby you've got on your car as a single version, all you need to do is now finish the adjustment, and that's the metering jet adjustment. Take that back basically 2 full turns on the adjustment screw at the bottom. That should give you a rough mixture to get going. And your idle speed screw, take it down till it hits the throttle arm, and take it down about another 1.5 to 2 turns, and that should be enough to start your car.